I have a problem. This is my main lens for wedding filmmaking, the Canon EF 24-70 f2.8 Mark II, and it's sadly lacking one very important feature, image stabilization. Because I shoot on the Canon C70, I unfortunately do not have the luxury of IBIS, and as I make the move to shooting primarily handheld, I'm realizing just how shaky my little hands are. So I wanted to look into getting a lens with built-in IS. Now you may think that the obvious solution would be to get the Sigma EF 24-70 f2.8 because it's the same focal length and it has IS, but I refuse. That's right, come at me, McLean.
This lens is great.
The Sigma 24-70 is a thick boy, and the Canon 24-70 speed booster combo that I'm already using is heavy enough as is. I need something smaller and lighter that has IS built in, and that's where the Canon RF 15-35 comes in. Now right off the bat, there are some things I would be giving up if I made the switch to this lens. Lower focal range for one. I'd be losing about 15mm of reach on the long end. I'd also be losing depth of field since I would no longer have the full frame field of view that the speed booster gave me. And with the loss of the speed booster, I'd also be losing about one stop of light. That's a lot to give up, which is why I wanted to make this video to find out if I can actually replace my 24-70 with a 15-35. Before I get into testing, I do want to give some quick clarification. I am testing these two lenses specifically for use on the Canon C70. The C70 has a Super 35 sensor, which means that compared to a full frame camera, the image will appear cropped in by about 1.5 times. So this 15-35mm lens will actually look more like a 22-52mm lens when used on the C70. Because I pair my EF 24-70 with Canon's 0.71 speed booster, I'm able to more or less negate the 1.5 times crop of the C70 sensor, but the speed booster will not work with the 15-35 because it already has an RF mount. This basically means that I am now comparing my 24-70mm lens to a 22-52mm lens. It's also worth noting that because the C70 has a crop sensor, it will not be utilizing the entire image circle of the 15-35. I'm really only using the center portion of the lens. This is important because I may experience different image quality than you would if you were using this lens on a full frame camera. I'll link a video below that does a great job explaining the differences between different sensor sizes from Gerald Undone. It's a very detailed and technical video, but I think it very well describes what's going on here. Okay, on to testing. When it comes to focal range, it's kind of no contest. The 24-70 is the obvious winner here with an extra 15 or so millimeters of range. The 15-35 does have one thing over the 24-70 though, with about 2 extra millimeters on the wide end. When it comes to size and weight, the 15-35 is easily the winner here. It's lighter by a pretty substantial margin, and it's shorter, especially when compared to the 24-70 fully extended. One super nice thing about the 15-35 being so much shorter is that it's much better balanced when you're using it on a gimbal. To test the autofocus, I filmed myself in various lighting conditions, walking and running towards the camera to see how well the lenses did at tracking me. I also shot a couple inanimate objects with handheld movement. For tracking, they both seem to perform about the same. From what I can tell, there doesn't really seem to be much of a difference here. The 15-35 did a little bit better in a couple tests, but it was pretty negligible to be honest. I did notice that setting the AF response on the C70 to +3 made object tracking dramatically better regardless of the lens. I'll definitely be playing around with that setting when my autofocus is having some trouble. I did notice that the 24-70 is very stuttery when focus racking from the background to the foreground. It stutters quite a bit and the focus breathing becomes very noticeable. The 15-35 doesn't display any noticeable focus breathing or stuttering when racking focus though. The focus rack is nice and fast, but not so fast that it looks robotic. It obviously racks faster than a human probably could, but it still looks pretty natural. I did all of my subject tracking tests in 3 different lighting scenarios: shade, direct sunlight, and backlit. In the backlit scenario, they both seem to struggle a little bit, but I think this really comes down more to the C70 not being great at autofocusing and less to do with the lenses. One thing that has really bugged me about the 24-70 is the very audible focus motor noise. I keep a shotgun mic mounted to the top of my camera to pick up ambience and random bits of dialogue throughout a wedding day, but it can often become completely unusable due to the lens motor just whirring away in the background. But thankfully, the 15-35 is completely silent. Didn't hear a thing. The IS on the 15-35 is one of the main reasons I was interested in this lens, and I can now say that it definitely works well. I was able to take this lens on a styled shoot, and after going through the footage, I basically don't have to use warp stabilizer at all, aside from, a handful of shots here and there. Here's a quick comparison of my handheld footage with and without the IS enabled. I would happily keep the IS enabled for pretty much any situation outside of tripod use. Plus, I think it actually makes my gimbal footage just a little bit smoother. In order to see if there were any color differences between the two lenses, I completely blacked out the room I was filming in and filmed the subject with a single key light. Both the light and the camera was set to 5500 Kelvin. The lenses are honestly very similar to each other, both a little bit on the warm side, and it looks like the 24-70 is just a little bit greener. Trying to compare the bokeh between these two lenses does become a little bit tricky because the 24-70 has the speed booster on it. Because the speed booster gives the 24-70 a full frame field of view, it's basically always going to have more depth of field as long as the camera is the same distance from the subject. I don't want to get super in depth on how speed boosters affect depth of field and bokeh in this video, but I'll link to a few videos that explain it well. The important thing for you to know for this lens comparison is that if the camera is 5 feet from the subject, all the camera settings are the same, and the framing has been matched between the two lenses, the lens with the speed booster will have more depth of field. My goal with these bokeh tests was 1, to find out how much depth of field I can get out of each lens at their lowest f-stop, and 2, to compare bokeh shape and see which one has the best looking bokeh. Like I just mentioned, the 24-70 is obviously going to come out on top when it comes to depth of field. As for the quality of the bokeh itself, the 15-35 has almost perfectly circular bokeh with a very strong outline, red and green fringing, and some onion ringing. As I move to the edge of the frame, it does become slightly misshapen, but it's very well controlled, only warping very slightly. The 24-70 has fairly round bokeh, but you can kind of see the shape of the aperture blades. The bokeh outline is much less intense here. There is a touch of red fringing, although I think this lens has less of it than the 15-35 did. There is noticeable onion ringing though. And as I move it to the edge of the frame, the bokeh starts to squish, and I'm not really liking the shape that it produces. It's weirdly angular. This is obviously up to your personal preference, but for me, I like the 15-35 more. The really strong outline around the bokeh isn't great, don't really love that, but I do really like that it holds that circular shape so well. The 24-70 for me is not great. I think the more angular shape of the bokeh is quite ugly. It does have more depth of field though because of that speed booster, so that's definitely something to think about. When it comes to flaring, the speed booster attached to the 24-70, which is normally a very big benefit and it adds a lot of extra stuff, becomes a very big disadvantage here. Canon's speed booster is known for having very poor flaring performance. I've linked a video below from Josh Satin. He does a great job explaining what exactly this issue with the speed booster is and how it affects your image. And just like I thought, the 24-70 is the clear loser here. It's not just that the flare itself is large, the whole image gets very washed out. You also have that weird purple spot in the middle of the frame to deal with. To be fair though, I don't experience that purple spot very often. Even in these tests, I only got the purple spot to appear when shooting directly into the sun. It didn't even show up when I had the light pointed right down the barrel of the lens, but it is still something to be aware of. The flaring on the 15-35 is much better controlled, and the flare itself just kind of looks nicer. Moving on to sharpness and chromatic aberration, and I will give a large caveat here. I've never tested a lens for sharpness before, and honestly, I'm not really sure what I'm doing. That being said, here's what I found. The 15-35 is sharper at f4 than it is at f2.8, and it does seem to be sharpest at 15 millimeters, and it gets a little bit softer at 24 and 35. The corner and edge sharpness appear very good, and it stays fairly consistent across the entire image. The 24-70 is horribly soft at 24 millimeters. It is possible that it's just my copy of the lens, but it is quite terrible. It does get a lot better from 35 onward though. 35, 50, and 70 all seem equally sharp and hold up nicely to the 15-35. It's definitely softer at f2 than at f4 though, and the edges are softer than the center. When it comes to chromatic aberration, the 15-35 is in the lead. It just flat out has less chromatic aberration. Both lenses have it, but the 15-35 has less of it. And in my opinion, it also looks better. The 24-70 has purple and green fringing, while the 15-35 has red and blue, which to me looks more pleasing. Not very many people talk about minimum focus distance when they're reviewing lenses, but it's actually something I run into quite a bit when trying to shoot detail shots on a wedding day. Big loss for the 24-70 here, the minimum focus on this lens kind of sucks in comparison. I was able to get the 15-35 way closer to the subject, and my own testing aside, the rated minimum focus distance is also just better on the 15-35. The speed booster is kind of something I forgot to factor in while testing this. You definitely get different results if you were not using it, since the image would appear more cropped in without the speed booster. That being said, I exclusively use the 24-70 with the speed booster, so for my own use case, the 15-35 is the better option here. Focus breathing is another big loss for the 24-70. There is some serious focus breathing going on, and if you're racking focus quickly from the foreground to the background, you're going to notice it. Really great performance out of the 15-35 though. I'm not 100% certain of this, but it feels like there's zero focus breathing. Now keep in mind that the C70 has a Super 35 sensor, meaning that there is that 1.5 times crop when compared to full frame. If you use the 15-35 on a full frame camera that can use the lens's entire image circle, you very well may experience focus breathing. And similarly, if I use the 24-70 without the speed booster, all the focus breathing issues may very well just go away. I didn't test for that though, so can't say for certain. There were a couple of other things I noticed while testing that didn't really fit into a specific category. The 24-70, for instance, actually gets darker when you zoom in. I don't know why. It's the equivalent of dropping the exposure by about half an ISO. I also experienced something strange with the 15-35. I was zooming in and out very quickly and noticed an odd exposure glitch, I guess you could say. When zooming really fast like this, the lens will momentarily become brighter and then correct itself. Not really sure what that's about, but it could just be an issue with the particular lens that I rented. Let me know if any of you have experienced the same thing. Alright, so where does that leave us? Can the 15-35 replace my 24-70? I think for most situations, the answer is yes. For basically everything except the ceremony and maybe the toasts, the 15-35 would be great. For those situations where I need the extra reach, I can just switch back to the 24-70. I do prefer to keep my kit as minimal as possible, but I'll happily pack an additional lens for the added benefit of image stabilization. Like I mentioned at the beginning of the video, I'll also be losing depth of field and about one stop of light by switching to the 15-35. At this point, I don't think I really have enough experience with the lens to be able to tell if that's going to be a deal breaker for me. I think I just need to use it on an actual wedding and see how I feel about the footage afterwards. Right now, I feel okay giving up those things for better handheld footage. But who knows, maybe I'll shoot a few weddings and realize the 24-70 is the better option. I'll just have to wait and see. Now if Canon ever makes an RF version of their EF 17-55 f2.8, I would buy that lens so fast. And yes, I did test that lens out, but it unfortunately just had too many drawbacks to actually be able to consider it. So yeah, that's about it. What do you guys think? Have I made a horrible choice? Should I reconsider the Sigma 24-70? Maybe. I don't know.
Hey, you're recording.
Hey, I'm recording. Wow.
Hi, we're marriage.
Boop, 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 boop. My monitor is going to sleep in the background. Why? I looked at the monitor. For 13-35. I can't freaking say words. Come on, focus on me. Not gonna put that in.